There are 3 steps that you can take to regain motivation after a bad game. And so I'm going to go over these 3 steps, but what I want to talk about first is why you lose motivation after bad games in the first place. So after you have a bad game or even a bad practice, why do you feel like you lose that motivation to where you wake up the next day and you have absolutely no drive like you did compared to the day before you had the bad game or the bad practice? Well, this is something that I experienced a lot when I was playing, where after every single bad game and even after practices, I felt like I didn't even want to get out of bed. I was so upset with myself, and I felt almost embarrassed to go to practice. And that brings us to one of the first reasons why you may be losing motivation after a bad game, and that is shame. The shame of, feeling like you let your teammates down, feeling like you let yourself down, your parents down, your coaches down. When you experience that level of shame, a lot of times it is easy to lose that motivation because you don't have that drive the next day to get up and to go to practice or to go to the next game or even show yourself in the weight room with your teammates. But once again, we know that motivation is so important, so we have to work on regaining that motivation. And another reason why you might be losing this motivation has to do with the way you're talking to yourself after games. Now, your self-talk, so the way you think and the way you're talking to yourself, plays a very large role in how you feel. This is known as a thought-feeling cycle, where you have a thought, that thought leads to a feeling, the feeling fuels further thoughts, right? And so after you have a bad game, and like I said earlier, even a bad practice, if you experience a lot of negative self-talk, so you start beating yourself up, you start tearing yourself down, thinking, I suck, I let everybody down, I can't believe I'm so terrible, why am I playing so awful right now? When you have that type of negative thinking, what happens is you will experience a lot of negative feelings. So when you're waking up the next day or even days after you have that bad game, if you are noticing that your motivation has dropped, you need to start looking to your thinking, right? Because if you're thinking so negatively and tearing yourself down, you're not really giving yourself much opportunity to have any type of motivation at all. And then a third reason why you might be losing motivation is fear. If you play poorly and then you have the fear of not wanting to play poorly again, kind of a coping mechanism that our minds will do is reduce motivation, because if we don't have that drive to go out there, then we are probably not putting ourselves in that position to have the same kind of shame or negative self-talk or just to fail like we did before. So those are the 3 reasons why you might be losing motivation. But now let's talk about how you can regain this motivation. Now, this isn't always easy, because when we're looking at the situation when you are lacking motivation, it's after a bad game, it's after a bad practice, and we know first and foremost that you are feeling down. And whenever you're feeling down, the hardest thing to do is to pull yourself out of that. But the truth is, the only person after bad games that can help you regain this motivation is yourself. So there has to be a lot of work put in to try to pull yourself out of those depths. And I only preface it by saying that because I don't want you to feel like regaining that motivation will be just a snap of your finger, an easy thing to do, because it is a difficult thing to do, but it takes perseverance, takes persistence, and you can pull yourself to where you have that motivation following these bad games. So step 1 within this 3-step strategy is that you want to focus on a positive first. Whether it's right after the game, whether you give yourself a little bit of time and you do it that night, or you even do it the next day, you need to get yourself thinking about some positives from the game. Now, I know this first step is probably the absolute hardest, because if you had a bad game or you had a bad practice, it will not at all be easy for you to find any sort of positive. But I was going through this practice with one of my clients that I'm working with right now in one-on-one coaching, which, by the way, if you are interested in one-on-one mental performance coaching, I've put a link to learn more in the description below. But we were talking about this idea of trying to find a positive after a bad game, and she had played a bad game recently. And when I asked her about what were some things that she did good, because in the coaching I have an evaluation system that we use, and one of the questions has to do with this idea of focusing on the positives. And she had left it blank, right? So she couldn't think of any positives. But when I asked her about different situations, I said, were you a good teammate? Did you pick your teammates up? She said, yeah, I picked my teammates up. I said, did you have any moments where you feel like you made a good decision? She said, yeah, I did. So right there were those were 2 positives from her performance. Now they weren't, these huge positives that we could then classify as, okay, I had an outstanding game. But the truth is, when you're wanting to regain motivation, if you've lost that motivation, whether it's because of shame, negative self-talk, fear, or honestly anything else, we know at that point you're focusing way too much on the fact that you had a bad game, but that's easy to do because the bad game is like bright flashing lights staring you in the face saying, I played terribly, you played terribly, it was just a bad game. So you have to work on focusing on some positives. And even if they are small positives like, I was a good teammate, I picked my teammates up, or I moved on from a mistake pretty well during the game, that will really help in getting you on this path of regaining motivation, because when you feel like you're doing things well, you feel like you're making progress. And progress is the cornerstone for any type of motivation. Now, step number 2 is you want to ask yourself, why? And this why comes in two forms or two different questions. Why did I lose my motivation? And then why do I want to regain my motivation? So when you ask yourself, why am I losing my motivation, or why have I lost my motivation? This will help you get clear on what's a driving factor. Is it shame, right? So am I feeling embarrassed? Is it self-talk? Is it fear? So let's use self-talk as an example. If you recognize that you are having negative self-talk and that's what's causing you to lose motivation, then right there we know that something you need to be doing is really focusing on the way you're talking to yourself. So try to think about the game in a different way. Try to think a little bit more positively about how you can learn from the mistakes you made and how you will be able to turn it around and have a better practice and have a better game next time. But that second question where you ask yourself, why do I want to regain motivation? This one is so important because it's hard to regain motivation, like I said. So you have to have a real strong reason as to why you want to really work on getting this motivation back for yourself and for your game. And I'm going to guess that the reason you want to regain that motivation is because you love your sport. You want to get better. You want to play better moving forward. So ask yourself that second question, why do I want to regain motivation? And then step number 3 is you really just want to get moving. When we are lacking motivation after bad games or after bad practices, it's really easy to feel like I don't want to train, I don't want to go to practice, I don't want to put the work in. But the truth is, if you want to get that motivation back, you have to get yourself moving. You have to start taking steps towards how am I preparing for my next game? Whether it is doing something mentally, right? Doing some mental training, whether it has to do with preparing physically, going back to the weight room, going to do some drills, going to practice, or even if it's just moving on and, hanging out with your teammates and even just completely forgetting about the game. We need to start moving on to whatever is next. As long as you're hung up on that bad game, as long as you're hung up on the bad practice, you'll still be losing motivation because it'll be fueling your frustration. But the quicker you can get yourself to move on, the more motivation you'll find, because you'll start to find yourself, getting better, improving on the mistakes you made, having a good time with your teammates, spending some time with your family, whatever you need to do, but start to move on because we need to be focusing on what's next instead of what's happened. So those are 3 steps that I encourage you to take if right now you are finding yourself losing motivation after bad games. Something else that can happen is you also lose your confidence after bad games. So what I've done right here is I've linked another video that goes into detail on some exercises you can use to regain your confidence as an athlete. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I put out new videos each week on sports psychology and mental training.